I wanted to start just with some words of Ursula Le Guin, who I think was one of the great guardians of the imagination in our culture. She said, as great scientists have said, and as all children know, it is above all by the imagination that we achieve perception and compassion and hope. So what I want to talk about today is, I'm just going to share my screen so I can show you some pictures, which hopefully you can see. If I make them big like that, then you can see them, and hopefully you can see me as well. So I want to talk about what seems to me is one of the main obstacles to the wonderful ideas that we've heard over the last couple of days becoming a reality, becoming the world that we need to see. And I always feel like ever since we started the transition movement 13 years ago, we've argued that the big challenge that we have is, at the moment, we stand on top of this mountain of energy and carbon emissions and stuff, and we need to get urgently down off this mountain, and we need to get down to the bottom half of this graph. I've long argued that the only way that's going to happen is generate enough longing for that place. If we can tell the stories about the bottom of this graph in such a way that we can generate longing and desire to arrive at that place, otherwise it's not going to happen. And of course that is a technical issue and it's a policy issue, but above all it's a storytelling issue. It's an imagination story. As Naomi Klein says, there are no non-radical solutions left. This is now fundamentally a time when it is our imagination that will get us through that. And that's what I'd like to talk about, because I feel like often when we try to inspire people with the need to move, the need to change, the need to create a new world, we often try to make them change by showing them pictures like this. We try to terrify people with apocalyptic images of what will happen if we don't move, rather than trying to bring alive and story tell about the future we could still create. We very rarely, for example, show people pictures like this, created by the artist James Mackay, who I think of as the man who draws the future. This is the cities where we live today. If in 10 or 15 years we had allowed biodiversity to come into the cities and we had redesigned the cities to accommodate biodiversity, I can almost smell that picture when I look at it. You know, when we get rid of cars out of our cities, which many cities are now really pushing for, post-COVID-19, that frees up a lot of space. What do we do with that space? Maybe we fill those streets with food production. Our children can walk to school past food being grown. You know, if we can start to tell these stories instead of the apocalyptic stories, maybe that's how we create the longing that makes it inevitable that we will create that kind of a world. And I have the privilege to go and visit places sometimes where this is already happening. This is not just happening inside Rob's head. This is a place in France called Montsartou near Nice, where a few years ago the French government said that 20% of all food in schools should be organic. So in Montsartou they said, well, why do we stop at 20%? Let's just go for 100%. So in Montsartou, the municipality made a market garden on the edge of the town. They grow 70% of all the food for all the schools in the city. It's fabulous. It's one of those climate change solutions that is a win-win, win-win-win-win. It's good for biodiversity, good for public health, good for mental health, good for local economy, led to all kinds of changes in consumer patterns of parents at the school. But it starts with trying to with a vision of where we could go and then actually making it happen. So for me, this is not all just a vision. I see this around the world. So why might it be that when we are surrounded by the kind of wonderful solutions that you've heard over the last couple of days, and when we recognize the urgency of the challenge that things aren't moving fast enough, and I'd like to suggest that maybe one of the reasons is that our imagination muscle, our collective imagination muscle, which should be like this, is kind of a bit more like this. And we are in a position where our ability to come up with new ideas is really limited. So this was some research published in 2010 in the US, looking at a creativity test done with big groups of people back as far as the early 1960s. The conclusion was that IQ and imagination rose together till the mid-90s, and then IQ kept rising and imagination went into a decline. And when this was published, it made the front page of Newsweek. And in the US, people said, oh, what does this mean for economic growth? And what does this mean for Hollywood? But where are the people saying, oh, what does this mean for agriculture? What does this mean for food and farming? What does this mean for social justice? What does this mean for climate change? If we're unable to imagine a different world first, then how do we create it? So I just spent the last couple of years researching a book called From What Is to What If, which was published quite recently. And I just want to give you a few of the key things that I think are underpinning this decline in imagination. And I'm going to frame them by using what if questions. I'll come on to why that's so important. So the first one is, what if play was at the heart of every day? One of the things that researcher blamed for the decline of our imagination has been the disappearance of play out of our culture. When I was a child, our streets were full of children who were playing. This was how they learned to cooperate, how they learned to manage conflict, how they learned to take risks. And we're producing children who can't take risks, and then we produce adults who can't take risks. I went to visit a street in a city near me where they closed the street and the children can come back out and play. They're intentionally creating safe places for children to play. It was magic. And you could see on that street how important that culture of play was, not just for the children, but for the community cohesion of that street. And as our children have retreated indoors, we've retreated away from each other as well. So in my town, we organized a festival of street games, where we closed a square at the top of the town and we filled it with play. For the first half, the adults stood around saying, isn't this marvelous to see our children playing? And for the second half, the adults decided they could actually play too. And then it was just chaos. And I saw many great games that day. This is a Dutch game called Spekerpuppen, where you tie a nail on a piece of string to the trousers or skirt. You have to look in through your legs. You have to try and get it into the leg. Just glorious. This girl played this for about 10 minutes. And bringing play back to our streets is so fundamental to the human imagination. And how do we bring play into our activism? This is a beautiful exercise that we developed through the transition movement, together with Encounters Arts, who are a big community arts organization. And it's an exercise where you imagine yourself stepping into the future in 2030, a future where everything that could have been done was done. It's not utopia, but it's an extraordinary shift from now. And then you find other people who share your interests, and you're asking yourself, what would I be doing in this future? And then when you've come up with your idea of what you might be doing in that future, you actively build it with cardboard and bamboo and string and sticky tape. You build a three-dimensional living, breathing version of this future that you've dreamed about. When we did it most recently, these young men here built the public transport network for our transition town anywhere, as it was called. They could tell you everything about this. It was completely realized in their imagination. They could tell you what it ran on, what the tickets looked like, how much the tickets cost, where it went. You know, when we can bring the future to life in our internal storytelling, it's a fundamentally powerful thing to do. And I know this works because I'm involved in so when we first did this exercise in 2012, I was with a group of people who created something called the Yeast Collective. That was a brewery and a bakery in the same space. And I could tell you everything about it, what the beers were called, how our training program worked, who we traded with. The following year in my town, we started a brewery called the New Line Brewery. Last year, we converted it to being a community-owned business to raise the money to move the brewery into the same building as a mill and a bakery. And when we ran this crowdfunding, people would say, but Rob, how do you know this will work? I'd say, I know this will work because I played it. I fundamentally know this will work because I played it. And that was the first time I got a really powerful sense of how important it is that we bring play into this work. What if we considered a healthy imagination vital to our health? I think all too often we think of the imagination as something a bit frivolous, a bit silly. There's a part of your brain called the hippocampus where the imagination fires from. It is the part of the brain also that is uniquely vulnerable to cortisol. When we are stressed or anxious or in trauma, it shrinks. When it shrinks, we lose the ability to be imaginative, to look at the future in hopeful and positive. So I set out to see if I could find a place where they were trying to rebuild the hippocampus, kind of a campus. Use that as a tagline for next year's conference, if you'd like to. And I went to Dundee and I met this amazing woman called Rosalie Summerton, who runs a project called Art Angel, working with stress, burnout, mental health problems using art. And they say, she says, when you walk through the door here, you're not a client or a patient, you're an artist preparing work for an exhibition. And that's what they do. And it just was the most beautiful place to go. Every year I met so many people there who told me their story about how they had lost sight of the future and now they could see it again. And every year, to get their funding, they give people a piece of paper with two outlines of a human body and say, fill the first in to show how you felt before you came here, and the other to show how you feel now you've been coming here. And it was very moving looking through these, and I just want to share one with you. Because to me, this is what it feels like. If we can get the shift to a low carbon society right, if we can get the shift to the kind of future you've been talking about in this conference right, that's what it'll feel like. And that's what we need to kind of bear in mind as we're moving forward with this. What if we followed nature's lead? All other great imaginative people in our culture, in our history, were inspired by nature. Our poets, our writers, our artists. During my lifetime, or since the Beatles split up, however you want to look at it, we've lost 60% of all the creatures we share this planet with. And I think that that has a knock-on impact on our imagination. When the diversity of the natural world around us is shrinking, what Michael McCarthy calls the great thinning, I think our imagination contracts with it. René Dubos, the microbiologist, used to say, if we lived on the moon, our imagination would be as barren as the moon. And this is an amazing project in London where they're using nature as a way to reawaken a city's imagination. It's called London, the National Park City. They mapped they mapped London to show all the green spaces and blue spaces. Realized that was 49.5% of London. Said if we add another 0.5%, then the majority of London will be green and blue space, so it could be a national park. And last July, the Mayor of London declared London a national park. And it's a whole project based around imagination, trying to invite people to say, that's 1 square meter for every person. Where's your square meter? So, reconnecting to nature, whether it's us going to nature or bringing nature to us, is fundamentally important for the imagination. What if we fought back for our attention? There's such a powerful link between imagination and attention. And I often think if Vincent van Gogh, when he first bought his bunch of sunflowers, had got his smartphone out instead, rather than really looking at at those sunflowers, and decided he'd check his Twitter, and his 2 hours later watching videos of skateboarders falling downstairs, we would have lost all of what this has brought to us over many decades now. We need to, in order to have an imagination and have an imaginative culture, we need to sustain our attention spans. And the reality is, at the moment, our attention spans are contracting, and we're losing the very paradigm, I fear, of depth out of our culture, that ability to dive deep into knowledge and really understand, because we're terrified of boredom, and we're trying to purge boredom out of our culture. In many ways, boredom is the time when your imagination is calling to you. What if school nurtured young imaginations? What if we had an education system that young people left at 18 with their imagination like a superpower, felt they could do anything, that anything was possible? In Italy, in Reggio Emilia, they developed a system of education fundamentally designed around how do we how do we create the imagination. Every school has a workshop at its heart. They talk about children as being authors of their own learning. It's a model that has inspired many people in other places around the world, including a school I visited in France near Arles, which is based in the middle of a 1,000-hectare permaculture agroforestry research project. The school has gardens, it has horses. It's it's an exploration of when you bring food production and agriculture and education all together in one kind of a beautiful setting. That we should be looking at our urban schools as being places where we bring urban agriculture, and every school should be like this, I think, I would argue. What if our storytelling was able to bring future to life, positive future? This is a guy, James Mackay, who drew those drawings I showed you at the beginning of this presentation. Sometimes he goes out with his easel and he sits by the street and he starts to draw what he sees in front of him. And as people walk past, excuse me, can you tell me how you think this place might look in the future? And then he adds their ideas into his drawing. It's a beautiful way of working. This is a guy called Per Gronqvist, who works for the Swedish government. And his job is chief storyteller, is the name of his job. And his job brief, I suppose, is to communicate the realities of day-to-day living in a carbon neutral world. To communicate the realities of day-to-day living in a carbon neutral world. Absolutely fantastic. And I read an interview with him where he said, my job is helping people to when they emotionally connect with an issue, then they engage. And I feel like every university should have a chief storyteller. Every course should have a chief storyteller. Every government department should have a chief storyteller. We should all be able to be chief storytellers who can bring to life in every conversation that we have about climate change, about agriculture, a vision of actually what it would be like. And a vision that moves beyond facts and figures and numbers and moves into a kind of a multi-sensory imagining. What would it smell like to live in that world? What would it feel like to walk down the street? What would a day in the life be like in that world? And storytelling is a fundamentally important part of it. What if we started asking better questions? And I feel like that ability to ask questions that start with the words "what if" is one of the most important skills that we need to cultivate over the next few years. I want to tell you two of the stories from two what if stories out of the book. This is in London, in Tooting, where in a district called in a district in South London called Tooting. In Tooting, they have nowhere that is like a town square or a village green. They have a busy high street full of traffic and nothing else. The local transition group said, uh, that there is a place that could be our village green. It's this place, which is currently just full of buses. It's a bus turning circle. The buses wait here to be called to go somewhere else. So Transition Tooting did a day called the Tooting Tour, where they took over that space. They sent all the buses away and they turned it into a kind of a carnival space. And they put real grass down on the ground. They filled that space with coffee and music and carnival and flowers and food. It was just beautiful. And over the day, I noticed the conversation change from "if this was our village green" to "when this is our village green." Something deep underneath the tectonic plates was starting to shift. What people felt was possible in that place. It was absolutely beautiful. I got to sit with my feet on the green grass of Tooting, and I noticed as the conversation changed, people started to say, "When this is our village green, what will we paint on the wall of this supermarket that normally nobody ever even looked at?" But the we want to make use of that wall as a celebration of the place and its stories. Something fundamentally shifted because they framed that what if question in such a beautiful. And in terms of food and farming and agriculture, one of my favorite stories that has come through the transition movement is this, which is a story from Liège in Belgium, where a few years ago, Liège en Transition said, what if in a generation's time, the majority of food eaten in this city came from the land closest to this city? Such a And they did a big event. They invited farmers, academics, chefs, anyone who cared about food. I went to that event. It was amazing. I then went home. I then went back there a few years later. And in that time, they'd started 21 new cooperatives. They'd raised 5 million euros of investment from local people. They had created a farm, two vineyards, a brewery, which I had to go and visit, and four shops in the center of the city, a delivery business between all of those different businesses. It was just amazing. It was so emotional for me as someone who spent years going around with this vision in my head of how the future could be, to find myself in that vision, that storytelling piece that I've been doing for 12 or 13 years. I was in that story. It was phenomenal. I met the mayor of the city who said, we used to say we wanted to be a smart city. Now we want to be a transition city. And our role as a municipality is just to get out of the way, is just to remove the obstacles to this becoming the story of this city. Absolutely beautiful. And it's something where it started because they got the what if. They created a basket in which people could come and bring their parts of that story. Um, so my penultimate what if question for you, which is a very difficult question in the UK in 2020. What if our leaders prioritize the cultivation of imagination? What if we recognized that part of the strategy of creating a new food and farming system, a new agroecology, permaculture, agroforestry system for the world is an imagination piece as well? Is that we have to create the best conditions for people's imagination to flourish. How would it be if we created a democratic system in which our imaginations felt really nurtured, like in Barcelona, where they have neighborhood assemblies all across the city, people neighborhoods pass their ideas up. That shapes policy in the city, which means that Barcelona now is one of the most, I think, imaginative cities in the world. What about an economic strategy for our cities, like they're doing in Preston in Lancashire, where the aim is to get the money to circulate as many times as possible, to see the hospitals, the universities, the schools being the anchor institutions for the new economy in that city that enable that money to circulate locally. The economic model we create can have a fundamental impact on the. This is a woman called Gabriela Gomez Mont in Mexico City, who works for the mayor of Mexico City, where she created what was in effect a ministry of imagination, which sounds like something in a Harry Potter book. But it sits within the administration and it tries to foster an imaginative culture throughout the governance of that city. It's, we don't have all the ideas. We need to listen to everything that's already happening, all the imagination already here in the city. Maybe we need to look to places like Bologna in Italy, where the municipality have created what they call a civic imagination office, which runs big visioning events in 6 labs around the city. And the most powerful thing that it does is when people come up with a great idea, is it says, okay, that's a great idea. How do we make that happen? Let's meet you in the middle. What can you offer? We'll, as a municipality, we'll offer this, 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 and this. If you can offer that and that, we'll make a pact. Good. Okay. So in the last 5 years, they've made 500 pacts in Bologna that range from making a small garden on the street to turning a big office block into a center for classical music training for young people. But there's something so important about it for me, which is that it meets imagination halfway. It's a fundamentally respectful approach that says, okay, we're going to invite you to be imaginative, and then we're going to meet you in the middle. So my very last question for you is, what if all of this came to pass? What would it be like to live in a time when anything felt possible, when imagination ran through our streets, through our politics, through our culture, through our media, when every day we were, the amount of things that were possible just excited and thrilled us, where the possibilities of a food and farming system that reimagined how the economy worked in our cities, where our streets were full of markets that reflected the diversity and the richness of the agriculture now running through and surrounding the cities where we live, when we could see health indicators rising, where we could see all the amazing innovation in foods and new products that brought around. What would that be like? Well, I guess I always get a bit of a taste of it being so central in the transition movement, which is something now that you'll find in 50 countries around the world, which is really an invitation, a kind of a what if space for communities to come together and ask what if and dream about what they could do next, but then to go and do it. It's not just about talking and thinking. Whether it's a small project like planting trees on your street, or sharing some seeds, whether it's a bigger project like building housing for people, or really big inspired stuff like they're doing in Liège, the most important part of this is that it's about giving people a taste right now in 2020, in May 2020, giving people a taste now of what that future would be like. So they can create what I like to think of as memories of the future. It helps to create a new North Star for people, a new story about what comes after this and where we go from here. And whether those projects are tiny or huge, they're all so precious and important, because that's what. So just to conclude, I guess what I would like to offer to this conference is to say, if we want to see a new flowering of imagination within our culture, we need to create the conditions for that. And I think there are 4 key conditions. The first one is imagination needs space. We all recognize in our own lives that our best ideas come to us not when we're on our laptop with a deadline, but when we're walking in the forest, when we're riding our bicycles, when we're in the bath, things like that. As a culture, we need to create those conditions for that space, whether it's universal basic income, working less, designing into our organizations and our meetings more space for reflection. The imagination needs space. Second is it needs place. It needs places where we can go that provide platforms for collective imagining. They could be schools, they could be urban agriculture projects like Princess Innengarten in Berlin. They could be all of those things that change our frame of what's possible, and we desperately need more of those. But they could be practices like I talked about, building the city out of cardboard, like an exercise that I'll be doing in the workshop at the end of the conference. We need those kind of practices that invite the imagination, and we need pacts. We need to meet the imagination in the middle and say, okay, we recognize that how important this is. Let's make that happen. Let's do that. So I'm within my time, and I hope this is a useful contribution. I guess my last thought is just to say that that when we talk about food and farming and a new vision of how food and farming could be, that we need to bring that storytelling piece, that the creation of that world is as much a work of the imagination, much a work of dreaming and longing as it is of policy and economics and changes and technology. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your reflections and questions.
Wir haben den Klimawandel, wir haben den Verlust der Artenvielfalt, wir müssen gleichzeitig eine wachsende Weltbevölkerung ernähren.
Die gemeinsame Agrarpolitik ist da gefragt, dass sie auf ökologische Standards setzt.
Ich will es halt einfach besser machen. Ich will der Natur was zurückgeben.
Bienenfreundlich, ressourcenschonend, nachhaltig.